portion of the day, I have a few announcements. First, please silence your cell phones and other devices. If you leave the building during the conference, you will have to go back through security, so please keep that in mind, especially during lunch. If an emergency requires you to leave the conference center but remain in the building, please follow the instructions provided over the building's PA system. If an emergency requires an evacuation of the building, an alarm will sound. Everyone should leave the building in an orderly manner through the main 7th Street exit. You'll turn left and proceed across D Street to the FTC Emergency Assembly area. Remain in that area until instructed to return. If you notice any suspicious activity, please alert building security. This event will be photographed, webcast, and recorded. By participating, you are agreeing that your image and anything that you say or submit may be posted indefinitely at ftc.gov or on one of the Commission's publicly available social media sites. Question cards are available in the hallway on the information tables immediately outside the conference room. Ryan Sue and Mohammed Batal will be available to collect your question cards. Please raise your hand and they will collect your card. For those of you participating via webcast, you can tweet your questions at FTC using the hashtag FTC Hearings. Please understand that we may not be able to get to all questions. Restrooms are located in the hallway just outside of the auditorium. And with all of that said, I would now like to introduce Andrew Smith, the Director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the FTC, who will be making some opening remarks.
Thank you, Elisa. Welcome to the FTC's hearing on data security. This is the 9th in a series of hearings that we're holding on competition and consumer protection in the 21st century. So thank you to all of the workshop participants for taking time from your busy schedules to share your expertise with us. Thank you for all of you for coming today. I understand this is being live streamed, so thank you to everybody in TV land. And a very special thanks to Elisa Gilson, Jim Trilling, and Jared Ho from our Bureau of Consumer Protection, Mike Legauer and Mark Lupino from our Bureau of Economics, and Dan Gilman and the many staff in the Office of Policy Planning that have made these 2 days possible. So first, a disclaimer. I speak only for myself and not for the commission or for any individual commissioner. Sometimes I'm not even sure that I speak for myself. That's because I'm new at this. I've been here about 6 months. And even more interestingly, all of our 5 commissioners are almost as new as I am. All have joined within the last 7 months. So this is an excellent opportunity for us to revisit policies and question old assumptions. So I don't know, with my disclaimer and my caveat about the amount of time that I've been here at the Commission, I really can't predict much, but I can predict this, that data security will continue to be an important priority for the FTC, and that the FTC will not be retreating from its role as the nation's primary data security law enforcement agency. Digital data security has never been more important to businesses and consumers. The rise of online banking, e-commerce, connected homes, connected cars, smartphones, and really with this, connected people. Digital data security becomes more important every day. But hardly a day passes that we don't hear about a new security breach at a major company, and of course this morning is no exception. By one count, there were more than 1,250 data breaches in the last year, with 4.5 billion records compromised. There's an old saw in the data security business, I understand, that there are 2 kinds of companies, those that have been hacked and those that have been hacked but don't know it yet. So what have we been doing on data security? Well, like many things in government, we use the 3-legged stool model. We have law enforcement, policy development, and consumer and business education. First and foremost, law enforcement. We like to think of ourselves as a law enforcement agency. That's where most of our work in this area is done. We have settled more than 60 data security cases on issues ranging from Internet of Things to children's data to financial records. And there's more to come. For example, in January, the FTC staff will be going to trial in D-Link, a case centered on IoT security. Policy development. 2 weeks ago, the commissioners testified before Congress about what data security tools the FTC is using and what additional tools it could use to protect consumers' data. The long and short of it was that the commissioners testified in favor of data security legislation with APA rulemaking for the FTC, along with civil penalties and expanded jurisdiction over telecommunications carriers and nonprofits and a couple of others. So, also in the realm of policy development, we're currently undergoing a routine regulatory review of our GLBA safeguards rule, which is one of 2 rules that we have made and enforce with respect to data security, the other being the COPPA rule. When this rule was initially issued in 2002, it was revolutionary in that it was risk-based and prescribed a process rather than a standard or an outcome. It became a model for other risk-based state and federal laws, and also provided useful guidance on data security for large and small enterprises alike. But in the fast-changing world of data security, very little stays up to date for 15 years, like the GLBA safeguards rule has, so we're in the process of revisiting that rule to determine if improvements are needed. Today's hearing is a part of the Commission's policy work, and the record developed today will help to inform the Commission further on how best to use its tools to promote appropriate data security. The final leg of the stool is consumer and business education. So I brought along a prop. This is our Cybersecurity for Small Business publication. All of these materials are on our website, and that's where ftc.gov/smallbusiness, and that's where most of the distribution of these materials is done. So these are new materials intended for small businesses, but really can be translated to any business. It includes fact sheets, it includes videos on our website, it includes quizzes and similar training materials for small businesses. Included in here are sort of the basics of data security, physical security, and the NIST framework. We also address 4 specific scams that target businesses: ransomware, phishing, email spoofing, tech support scams, and then we also delve into more technical issues such as vendor management, cyber insurance, both first-party coverage and third-party coverage, email authentication, web hosting, and remote access. So importantly, this campaign is co-branded with NIST, DHS, and the Small Business Administration, and we also got input from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. We held a series of roundtables with small businesses in 2017, and they all told us that they need a single unified message from the federal government. They felt as though they were getting different and sometimes conflicting messages from different government agencies, and they wanted one single unified message with easy-to-use resources about cyber threats and how to deal with them. So we responded with this new business education campaign. So that's a useful reminder that we're not the only ones policing data security and providing guidance. So you just heard about our critical partnership with NIST and DHS and SBA, but of course we also have the Department of Justice and the U.S. Postal Inspectors and other federal and state criminal law enforcers who are on the beat. State and federal banking, healthcare, insurance, securities regulators also are policing data security and providing guidance. We have our good friends and partners, the state attorneys general, and of course private industry initiatives, including the payment card network, including the payment card industry data security standards, as well as standards promulgated by public utilities and defense industry and others. Yet, despite all of our best efforts, we seem not yet to have achieved optimal data security. The daily rash of breach announcements make it seem as though all of our efforts are just a drop in the ocean. How do we explain this? On the one hand, maybe our current approach is working, and the apparent uptick in breaches is just a result of more data moving online and the greater sophistication of attackers, or maybe more and better intrusion detection and reporting of breaches. On the other hand, maybe our current approach to data security requires some serious rejiggering. Or maybe the current approach is solid, but we just need more of it and better tools to achieve it. So we're here today to ask tough questions about the state of data security and data security regulation. What are the incentives to invest in data security, and are they enough? What does consumer demand for data security look like? Does consumer demand meaningfully drive data security investment? Should we expect consumers to participate in securing their own information? How can we best assess data security at specific firms, and how can we communicate that assessment to the relevant stakeholders, to executives, boards, cyber insurers, card issuers, consumers, regulators? Which regulatory and enforcement approaches are working? Why are they working? Can they be improved? And finally, we need to take a hard look at the FTC. Are our tools up to the task of identifying and remedying lapses in data security? So we're going to be examining these big questions over the course of the next 2 days. This morning, we'll start by focusing on data breaches. Mark Spittler from Verizon Security Research will present on the Data Breach Investigations Report, the annual chronicle of data breaches and their causes. Next, Sebastian Gay from Georgetown's Economics Department will describe his work on how some firms internalize the cost of data breaches and whether their stock prices take a hit and how those firms mitigate that potential impact. And finally, Al Pascal from Javelin Strategy and Research will describe some markers of how data breaches affect consumers. This afternoon, we'll turn to 2 panel discussions. The first will discuss the incentives to invest in data security, ranging from consumer trust to compliance obligations to cyber insurance, and explore how companies make those investment decisions. The second panel will explore consumer demand for security. During this discussion, we'll hear about emerging security ratings that allow consumers to compare the security of products and whether we can count on consumers to shop on security. Tomorrow, we'll tackle data security assessments. Assessors from a variety of backgrounds, Big Four accounting, security boutiques, cyber insurance firms, will react to a series of hypothetical assessment situations. And these hypos, panelists will address thorny issues like who defines the appropriate scope of an assessment? How does a company with a tight budget and big problems gauge security? And when to look to inside expertise and when an outside perspective may be better. Next, Commissioner Becca Slaughter and Joshua Corman, the co-founder of the I Am the Cavalry Security Initiative, will talk about the current threat landscape and emerging threats. Tomorrow afternoon, panelists will turn to policy with a pair of panels on the U.S. approach to data security and FTC data security enforcement. These panels will examine what regulatory approaches are working, what's falling short, and how the current approaches could be improved. So, we have a lot to cover with presenters and panelists who have thought a lot about these important issues. I'd like now to turn it over to Jared Ho in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection and Mark Lupino in the Bureau of Economics, who will start us off with a series of presentations about data breaches. Thank you all for coming today and for helping us to think about the state of data security.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for those remarks, and good morning, everyone. We're delighted to be here today to kick off the first session of the day. My name is Jared Ho. I'm an attorney with the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection at the Federal Trade Commission. My co-moderator is Mark Lupino. He's an economist in our Bureau of Economics. We will start out this morning with 3 presentations from our highly esteemed guests, discussing the current state of data breaches and the impact of those breaches on both firms and consumers. First, you will hear about the trends our experts are seeing. We will then have what we expect to be a lively conversation with our presenters to delve deeper into their perspectives on the threats to consumers' personal information. We will be taking questions from the audience. If anyone in the audience has a question, there are question cards on the table located directly outside of the auditorium. Please flag down our conference staff, either Ryan or Mohammed, and they will be collecting those cards and passing them to us.
Okay. There are more detailed bio online, but very briefly, we have Mark Spittler, who leads the Verizon Security Research Team. He's a lead author of the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report series and is involved in the development of the vocabulary for event recording and incident sharing framework, otherwise known as VERIS. We also have Sebastian Gay, who teaches in the Department of Economics at Georgetown University. He specializes in financial privacy and real estate economics research, and he's an assistant director for the financial analysis for the Congressional Budget Office. And finally, we have Al Pasquale, who's a senior vice president for research and head of fraud and security at Javelin Strategy and Research. With that said, I will turn it over to Mark Spittler for the first presentation of the morning.
Well, hello, everybody. My name, again, is Mark Spittler. I'm here to talk about the results that we found in the 2018 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. A brief history for those of you who may not be as familiar with it. This is a publication that we put out annually. This is the 11th iteration of it. So we've been doing this since about 2008, really about 2008, 2009. And the reason that we started it in the first place was we just were not seeing enough real-world data being presented back out to the public on what is really happening as far as cybercrime. There was a lot of discussions and people that are selling various widgets and services about things that you need to be worried about and it wouldn't be awful if this happened. We had a lot of that type of information coming to us, but what we didn't really know is when people are actually suffering real-world data breaches, who's behind it, what are they doing, what methods are they using, who are they targeting, and why. And so we put out the first report back then, and we've started to grow it ever since. So we are, obviously, me and my team are very, very fond of good data sources, and we were not wanting for data this year, as you can see from some of the numbers on the slide there. We had over 2,000 confirmed data breaches, and we had over 50,000 security incidents, and we defined a security incident as an event where either confidentiality, integrity, or availability of an asset was compromised. So people could get a denial of service that takes down their website. We would not call that a breach. We would call that a security incident. So just a really quick definition there. And our corpus is now well over 16,000 breaches and over 300,000 security incidents. So really big splashy numbers. I'm not trying to scare anybody with that. I'll try to reel it back in to kind of talk about how do we categorize these to be able to present something out to the public that they can actually take action on. When we first started this out, we had a single data source. We've now grown that to over 60. So we have participants from law enforcement, certs, both domestic and international, cyber insurers, other forensic partners. So we have a pretty good diversity of data. This is not every single incident that happened last year or every single breach. So we don't answer questions like, are we getting better or worse? What we're just trying to do is find, what are the tactics that are being used? What's the difference? And what does this mean to me if I'm in a particular industry? Do I have to look at something more often than somebody else? What's most likely going to affect me? What's my 3 o'clock in the morning call going to be? And one of the things that we'd like to take a look at is, why are these happening to begin with? So when there's confirmed data breaches and it is malicious, what is the motive of the adversary? More often than not, it's money. It makes sense. People are doing this not because it's not because of ideology very often. It certainly can be for strategic advantage, which would be the cyber espionage attacks that we do see. But from a frequency standpoint, it's money. They're going after data that can be monetized in the form of personal information, payment card information, banking information, and it's to make a dollar in some form or fashion. Now, this chart behind me is about breaches, and one of the more interesting trends is you don't actually have to have a confirmed data breach to make money anymore. One of the ways that they do that is ransomware. Ransomware has actually been around for quite a while, but it's really started to get a lot of publicity in recent years, and our data actually backs that up. So we are seeing within our data set an increase in ransomware year over year. It doubled last year. It doubled the year prior to that as far as number of incidents. So the little line graph behind me tells a couple of interesting stories. The first one, what this is showing is what assets are affected. So ransomware, really quick definition, it's malware that gets onto a computing system, and it will obfuscate or encrypt data, and then reducing, obviously, the utility of said data, and then the adversary will demand a ransom that you pay, and you may or may not get a key to unlock that. The first thing you might notice is that we actually have people on this slide, and you're probably saying, okay, how do you encrypt a human? You don't. But where we are able to figure out how malware got onto a system, if it involved some level of altering of human behavior via phishing, via email, we're able to note that. It seemed to go down quite a bit. That's really more indicative of back in 2014 when we didn't have as many of these. We knew what the malware vector was. A lot of these cases we're getting now, we know that ransomware occurred, we know what industry it affected, but they didn't provide us, or they did not record how the malware got on there. I would be absolutely willing to bet, if we had knowledge of every single malware vector, that people, because of the email being the means to get in, would be much, much higher. Our data shows that email is the predominant means of getting malware onto networks. Not only does our incident data show that, but we have a contributor that detonates millions and millions and millions of pieces of malware per calendar year, and their data also shows that they're finding this data and they're detonating it. It's coming in via email. So the one line that doesn't have as sharp of a drop, but I think is very interesting and concerning, is the one that says server, and it's the kind of the second one there, and it's got a slow rise. And remember, this is from a percentage of ransomware incidents, so the actual numbers in 2017, 2016, much, much higher. And when we see servers being affected by this, we realize that this isn't just one person, a user in your organization, getting ransomware, having his or her laptop or workstation encrypted. That's bad. No one wants that on any particular day. What we're seeing is that foothold is not being used and encrypted straight away. They're using that to move laterally within an organization. They're using it to find databases, file servers, even backup servers. Then they encrypt, and now you've got a much, much higher criticality event that's happening. They're able to ask for a higher ransom, and there's probably a higher chance that someone's going to pay it because you are in a much, much worse situation than if it was just a single laptop. And so ransomware is one of the things that we've seen kind of rise up over the last couple of years. That's why I have a slide here, and we have a section on it in the full report itself. So anything you see here is obviously going to be available in the full report and explained even more. The next topic I want to kind of touch on is social engineering. So the human factor, I've already kind of alluded to it with how a lot of ransomware gets onto systems. But we have seen a significant amount of real-world data breaches begin with social engineering, notably phishing. But we're also seeing a rise in what we call financial pretexting. Common examples of this are people in finance departments getting an email from, and I'm using air quotes here, the CEO that is saying, hey, we need you to pay this invoice before you go home for the weekend. Has to be happening now. Thanks for all your hard work. And they are duped into sending, basically wiring money directly to the adversary. Kind of like ransomware, there really wasn't a data breach there. They didn't necessarily give them their banking information. They were just flat out tricked into sending money to the bad guy. But we also see human resources departments actually being affected by this too. And that ruse is I'm from a payroll company, or I'm an executive, and I need W-2 information for all the employees. So that is obviously a data disclosure. They're providing this W-2 information that's being used for tax return fraud. Both of those kind of affect all industries fairly across the board. Anybody can be affected by that style of attack. We also see social engineering phishing being used by nation-state or state-affiliated groups. It's how they're gaining their foothold. It's how they're getting that kind of patient zero, if you will, within an organization to again, move laterally within a network, move deeper to find ultimately their end goal. So, as you can see, this slide is very busy. There's a lot of numbers on here, and we have a limited amount of time, so I will not be going through each of these individually. But what this shows is a breakout of different industries and some of the styles of attacks that we see. And I'm focusing really on the top left grid there. So, at the top going vertically are some industries, and going horizontally are some styles of attacks like crimeware, which is financially motivated malware, typically opportunistic in nature, ransomware being a prime example of that. Cyber espionage, again, that's going to be all about motive, who the adversary is, what they're after. Denial of service, pretty self-explanatory. Some of these other ones are self-explanatory, but what you can focus on here really, really quickly is, hey, some of these cells are a dark shade of blue and have large numbers in them. You can even squint your eyes and be able to kind of understand this is a heat map. Some areas have a strong level of correlation between the type of attack the industries see and versus others. So, a combination which would include restaurants, food service, hotels. If you go down, you can see, wow, they have a very, very big problem with people attacking their point-of-sale environments. Makes a lot of sense. They process a lot of credit cards. Cyber criminals enjoy credit cards because they can make money off of it, and we already saw that slide, which is what motivates most people. So we see a strong correlation there. So people can just take a look at this single figure. And there's a lot going on here. I could tell 2 hours of stories on this, but you can begin to say, hey, am I going to spend my time and my resources on a problem that's affecting me at a high level of frequency? Am I putting my money in the right place? Or am I focusing on something that maybe isn't going to be as important to me because of my industry and what has happened historically to people like me? And again, this is all in the full report, so you can absolutely review this, and you can draw a lot of interesting stories from it. Again, I'll touch on a couple of the tactics that are being used. We talked about ransomware. We talked about some of the social attacks, primarily phishing, which is via email, or what we call pretexting, which is really a little bit more sophisticated than just a phish, which is more of a fire and forget, spray and pray, if you will, type of tactic. Pretexting is where you develop a dialogue. You actually have a story. You have maybe done some intelligence gathering to know who the right target is within that organization. But some other things are happening too, right? We see use of stolen credentials as one of the primary tactics that adversaries are using. When we think about hacking and when we think about the bad guys, and you have maybe this Hollywood vision of someone, in a dark room, probably wearing a hoodie, and they're, hammering away at a keyboard, and they finally find that way in. In reality, what they're trying to do most often is to fish some credentials off of someone and then reuse those. Why would they want to do something harder than that? Why would they want to do something that could be detected easier than reuse of credentials? So we see a lot of attacks on single-factor static authentication, and we see that used all too often to protect highly critical types of data where we need to have stronger authentication, not just from a outside in to your network, but also even when you're on your network. We need to see stronger barriers between that first laptop that might be infected and other areas with the other deeper security zones. Other types of malware that we're seeing, we see what's called backdoor or command and control. That establishes that foothold, that's persistence. It allows the attacker to take hold of a system and use that as their entry point, and they can issue commands to it. So you can kind of see, if you took a look at some of these, you see phishing, which can lead to backdoors and C2s, which can lead to other types of malware that'll capture credentials, which can lead to the reuse of that. So you see how these things are not mutually exclusive, but they can go in order and tell the story about how attackers are really trying to go about their business. So that's kind of a high level of the things that we were seeing, and certainly we'll have time to go over this in more detail as we go along with the panel. In front of you is the URL for the full 80-plus page report, and hopefully you'll be able to take a look at that. And if you do have any other questions, that report will also have email addresses that you can actually come back and ask us questions about the data, and we'd be more than happy to answer those.
Thank you very much, Mark. We'll now turn it over to Sebastian Gay for the second presentation this morning.
Thank you. Mark, Jared, thank you for inviting me this morning to talk about my academic research on privacy breaches. I want to remind the panel and the audience that I'm here in my personal capacity. None of these views reflect the views of my current employer on this particular topic. And I do not have any ongoing research on the topic at the current time. Marriott, Target, Yahoo, Home Depot, and Anthem. All of these firms were breached recently. After the breaches, most of these firms did not encounter large decreases in their stock price. Most of them actually had new highs within a week of a disclosure. So what could explain this? A privacy breach is a short-term crisis for a company. With thoughtful preparation, like any other crisis, it can actually be prevented. Preparation requires prevention, so the let's avoided from Mark. Loss mitigation, it happened, what's the bottom line? Let's get the PR involved. Brand management, so let's restore the firm's reputation. And customer relationships, which is usually what you lose once you have that type of privacy breaches. Remediation costs for firms that fail to adequately protect consumer data can be quite large. Costly lawsuits, payments for credit report monitorings, and actually call centers, and loss of future businesses. In a well-functioning system, firms would protect themselves and insure themselves against those risks. And so the paper right here was asking the most important question at the time, that was, could firms leverage media coverage to protect themselves from costly privacy breaches? So in my paper that I think is available online, Strategic News Bundling and Privacy Breach Disclosures, I examine how firms can build up a repository of positive news that could then be used at or around the same time that a privacy breach is disclosed to offset its negative effects on the price. So privacy breaches, as established before by Mark, are unexpected and usually negative news for companies and the stock market. Given their unexpected nature, the effect of privacy breaches has been difficult to measure in the economic and finance literature. When using event studies to examine the price of a stock of affected firms before and after the disclosure of a privacy breach, academic papers have found both a positive and a negative effect. So the question here was, why could that be? And so looking at the state in which the breach happened, you can look that there are discrepancies in the disclosure laws. The legal disclosure time for a privacy breach, depending on the state, can be of a few days to actually a few months. That potential lag raises the question of whether firms strategically releasing over news around the same time as a privacy breach can attenuate the effect on its stock price, and then provide a softer effect on its reputation and its brand name. So now let's get on to the data that was used in the paper. I had a list of privacy breaches that I compiled from 2005 to 2014. At the time, I relied a little bit on the Verizon report, but there was also no official reporting standard that was adopted. So the compilation of all privacy breaches ended up being a very difficult task. Data validation was important, and I used more than 4 different sources to try to find out whether or not the date of the release was correct, when the breach actually happened, and the number of customers that were affected by the breach, as well as the magnitude of the breach. The problem here is that the term like breach accounts is very vague and used a lot of times. Stock prices and other data on companies are available through academic resources. And the news data came actually from a very rich data set that compiles all of the news that are available for every company with a timestamp. So think about something like, for the data set that I had, like 13 million observations. The news data are classified into 3 types: breaking news reports, and press releases. Overall, the paper contains 542 privacy breaches for the time period 2005 to 2014. It doesn't contain all of the incidents that Mark talked about because I had to match it with stock market data. And the panel, as I mentioned, had more than 13 million observations. So during the research project, a few patterns on the data emerged. The first one, very interesting, is that not all privacy breaches are reported in the news. And actually, 50 breaches that were available in the sample were not present at all in the news at any point in time. More than 30 to 50%, depending on the industry, of the breaches were not even the target of any breaking news alert. 2, there was a lag between the time of reporting and the actual breach that can be actually quite lengthy. It went from a few days to years. And we may want to talk about it with the panel, but when the FBI gets involved and there's an investigation, the time at which you have to report your privacy breach can actually be extended. The third one is firms are ready to announce a remedy most of the times when they disclose a privacy breach. So they come ready for it. 4th is only half of the privacy breaches in the sample reported an actual or even estimated number of records breached. And 5th, the more scary one, is firms can actually be breached multiple times. Some people may say they don't learn. Some others may say, like Mark mentioned earlier, show me the money. It happens more often in the retail, finance, and insurance industry. So those social security numbers and bank accounts are very valuable to hackers, so they may be more willing to go back to the same source. So intuitively, privacy breaches reporting and media coverage can actually be thought of as some sort of a tide. The paper establishes that there is a sharp drop on average, obviously, in the average daily negative news compared to the usual level right before firms are disclosing a privacy breach. And this result is all the more surprising that I'm including in that number the actual release of a privacy breach as a news event. So really, if you take that out, it's almost, you would get into the negative if you wanted to push that. More surprisingly, there's also a decrease in the amount of positive news right before and a strong increase right after the disclosure of a privacy breach. So this pattern seems to suggest that there is an intentional timing of a disclosure when firms release a privacy breach. So the paper runs a series of modified event studies using the amount of abnormal news, defined to make it simple as the deviation for the mean number of news stories on a given day. The idea behind it is a firm like Apple has more news on a given day than Colgate. So, and I do that for both positive and negative abnormal news. So what you notice is that there is a significant negative effect of a breach disclosure on the stock price on the day and the day after the disclosure. So something like 24 to 27 basis points. Surprisingly, a firm that has been breached multiple times sees a decreasing effect of the privacy breach on its stock price. So that seems to reinforce the fact that firms learn and kind of use a little bit more the media straw that they had available in order to attenuate this effect. But where it's very interesting is if you look at the effect of an additional piece of positive news story compared to the usual amount of positive news on any other day, you find an effect that is 15 times higher. Like the effect of a positive news, an additional one, is 46 basis points on the day of disclosure of a privacy breach versus only 3 basis points on any other day. And this is very consistent throughout the entire sample. So you notice this completely offsets the negative effect of the privacy breach that was around like minus 24. Surprisingly enough, the market capitalization and the number of records breached when available, do not have any effect on the result. Something interesting too is that the result vary by industry. There's more of a negative effect for financial firms than there is for just like the retail industry, for example. So this could be due to the strategic and sensitive component of the data that the firms have to got stolen. So the effect of stricter disclosure laws that are different in every state, as I mentioned, is significant and negative. So on average, it decreases the returns on the stock price by 17 basis points. So this can be, in a way, thought of as a partial insurance for the firms by knowing that if they have a privacy breach disclosure, they're going to have to release it to the market more quickly than in any other states. So this may seem that firms would actually spend more time protecting themselves when there are stronger disclosure requirements. So in a similar manner, you find that this effect is even stronger the day after the disclosure. We're talking 70 basis points. So if a sample were to be restricted to cyber attacks, because it seems to be like the topic of this panel, instead of all privacy breaches, all of the results that I mentioned, and you see that in the paper, are stronger, like twice as much of a negative effect on the release of a privacy breach. These results could actually be due to the fact that there are more sensitive informations that are coming out when you have a disclosure of a privacy breach that is obtained through a cyber attack. To give you an idea of how different privacy breaches and even cyber attacks are, I ran a similar type of analysis on different types of negative news to the stock market. And what happened is only an analyst downgrade would have a stronger effect on the stock market, on the stock price, of a firm. So congressional hearings, copyright infringements, fraud, industrial events, lawsuits, even product recalls do not have as strong of an effect and most of the time are completely insignificant. So this is really like quickly what's in the paper. You can find the paper online, and thank you for giving me the time to talk about it.
And thank you, Sebastian, for that insightful piece on the impact of data breaches on firms. Next, we're going to move over to Al, who will be giving us his perspective on the impact of data breaches on consumers.
Thank you. So first, I wanted to thank the FTC for having me today. I'm going to be sharing some research from Javelin's annual identity fraud study. As background, Javelin conducts a national study. We've conducted it annually for nearly 15 years, where we examine the incidence of identity fraud affecting consumers. As a definition, identity fraud is when personally identifiable information is misused to obtain something of financial value. In essence, it is financial fraud that's made possible through identity theft. For the sake of today's conversation, I'm going to be talking a lot about the relationship between fraud and data breaches. That relationship is strong. It has historically been strong, but fraud itself is changing. The role that breaches are playing when it comes to fraud is changing, and I think it demands a change in the way that we deal with breaches, and we also deal with the protection of consumers' data and consumers' accounts. We've been following this space for a very long time, the fraud space. 2017 stood out. 2017 was, in fact, a record year. More consumers than ever before, at least as far back as we've been keeping records, were affected by identity fraud, right, in absolute terms and as a proportion of the population, or at least US consumers. That was a record. The amount lost in 2017 was the highest we've seen in the last 4 years. Now, these are total losses associated with all cases of identity fraud. It is inclusive of losses that consumers are experiencing, as well as the businesses where these frauds took place. But a third piece of information that I think speaks very highly of why we're seeing some of these trends play out is that for the first time, when we asked consumers who were affected by a data breach, who received a notification, what kind of information was lost? For the first time, we saw that Social Security numbers were at the top of the list. Historically, it's been credit cards and debit cards. Now, we need to consider that there are 247 million US consumers. There are 1.2 or so billion cards in circulation. And historically, cards have been a high-profile target. It is typically pretty easy to access data. Generally, it's poorly protected. But fact of the matter is, consumers were more likely in 2017 to be told your Social Security number has been compromised than your card. And that's saying something when most people have about 8 cards in their wallet. Not only did it have a material effect on the type of fraud we saw, but it's also having effect on the consumer psyche. The type of information being compromised, the source of that information, and that is also very meaningful. And we'll talk about that first, and then I'm going to move into some trends around the fraud and the relationship between breaches and fraud, how it's being perpetrated. But I wanted to start with the consumer aspect. So when we're trying to measure the impact on the consumer, historically, one of the first questions has been, well, I guess, show me the money, right? What's the financial impact on the consumer? Well, in 2017, the financial impact more than doubled from the previous year. On average, consumers paid out of pocket $104, those who were affected by fraud. Now, it may not seem like a lot, but when you consider we had, well, more consumers than ever before, I think the total comes in somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion that consumers paid out of pocket. So it's not an insignificant amount of money that we're talking about. And it's true that the median loss is actually zero, because many people experience card fraud. But you have to imagine, given the size of that population and the fact that the median loss is zero, how many outlier cases have to exist that push the mean up that far in a single year? This is a function of the change of the types of fraud that we're seeing become quite popular. And so I'm going to dive into how different fraud types are changing. But there is a meaningful effect for many victims of fraud in actual dollars and cents, right? So there is harm there that we can measure financially. When we talk about breaches, I think it's important to consider that everyone in this room has probably received a breach notification or seen a notification in the news that indicated they may have been affected by a breach. So 2017 was not unique in that consumers generally had experienced breaches before. Right? This was not a new phenomenon for us to get a breach notification. So why was it different? Right? Why has our common vernacular changed as consumers? Why are we more concerned about cybersecurity? Why is our mindset changing? Well, I think first you have to consider the type of information that was compromised in 2017 was a bit different than historical. But on top of that, I think what ended up happening in 2017 was that there was a change in the consumer mindset because we did not have clear sightlines as consumers as to what the breach meant for us? Well, in the past, big breaches were generally card breaches. Now, we did have, large breaches of Social Security numbers, here and there. So there was OPM, there was Anthem, but Equifax was unique in the number of individuals that were affected, and two other facts. Number one, we have no control as consumers over whether or not Equifax has or had our personal information. And that's true of all the credit bureaus and a number of other companies as well. But on top of that, that information, right, that this company in particular held had to do with our financial wellness. So consumers were extremely concerned. They wanted to know, what does this breach mean for me? So if you go back through the Google search results, right, and you look at the search index, what you'll see is when the breach occurred, the search index goes through the roof. People went online, they wanted to know, what does this mean for me? There was a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness there, despite the fact that we've been breached so many times. Think about the number of notifications, the number of times your information has been breached in the last 10 years. You're not new to breaches as a consumer, but consumers had more questions than they had answers last year. And we can see that there's an impact, right, on how they view breaches and the steps that organizations are taking to keep them safe. So we ask a number of attitudinal questions around data breaches, and one of the agreement statements that we have within the survey is that data breach notifications merely help organizations save face or meet their legal requirements and do little to protect me. The agreement with that statement grew considerably year over year between 2016 and 2017. Now consider, again, your own personal experience. When you're receiving a breach notification, many of them look alike, right? They include pretty basic information about details behind the breach and information potentially about the credit bureaus to contact, right? Maybe even to contact the FTC in the event of fraud, right? But that's it. I mean, that's what we see time and time again. Meanwhile, that last slide shows that people had a lot of questions that were not being answered despite getting those breach notifications over and over again. So it would seem that consumers do not feel as though the way that we respond to data breaches, the way that organizations respond to data breaches and notifying them is sufficient. They do not believe it is sufficient, or at least that sentiment is growing, and it has grown considerably. And I think part of the reason why it has grown is because consumers are more concerned about what a breach means for their identity. We also ask about, in the study, concern around identity fraud. And concern around identity fraud also grew considerably. Now, typically, these are numbers that don't move very much year over year. So this is extremely meaningful, right? Going back to the earlier comment around the common vernacular, I think as consumers, we have a much more keen realization that the information that's being compromised online, right, in the digital space, does have more severe implications for our identity because we do so much online, and so do criminals do so much online. So when we see that our information is breached and we receive a notification, it doesn't tell us enough about what that means for the digital world where that information can and will be misused. So we're starting to tile these pieces together as individuals, and we're seeing that reflected in our data. And the experiences around fraud kind of back up that notion, right? It's not as though we're taking a leap of faith as consumers. Fraud is just becoming more prevalent, and we know, right? If you have been a victim of a breach before, odds are, your information has been misused to commit fraud. So you know that there's a connection there. In this chart, what you'll see are two different sets of bars. The blue bar is the fraud rate for all consumers in any 12-month period, any calendar year. The beige bar is the fraud rate for consumers who were notified of a data breach. Now, there's a strong correlation. There's always a strong correlation every year, right? This is not causation necessarily. And there are a number of factors that push that bar up and down, but fact of the matter is there is the relationship. It is very, very strong. And if I included the data for consumers who did not receive a notification, you'd see that the rate is typically between 2% and 3% every year. So there is a very, very clear relationship. Now, in 2017, you may ask, why did the rate go down? Well, it's very simple, right? That number is a function of the number of breach victims who experienced fraud over the number of breach victims. The denominator became very big in 2017, right? There were a lot of breach victims who had sensitive information compromised. Criminals simply couldn't use it all, right? And that's why that number declined. The fact of the matter is there is a strong relationship, and we know it. So we are more concerned. So talked about the consumers. I do want to shift into how this information is being misused, how it's manifesting. And I wanted to focus on, in particular, a couple different types of fraud. The first is account takeover. Account takeover is among the most meaningful and insidious types of fraud for both individuals and for organizations. So what do we mean by account takeover? Account takeover in this context is when a criminal gains effective control of an account. They will do that by changing contact information, by changing passwords, essentially separating you as an individual from the organization that's servicing that account. And this makes it extremely difficult for that organization to ever provide that control of the account back to you because they cannot discern the difference between the legitimate consumer and the criminal. This kind of fraud has tripled. It's tripled. Losses have grown considerably, and incidents has grown considerably. Now, you may ask, what does this have to do with data breaches? Well, two things. First, criminals can leverage personally identifiable information to gain access to personal accounts. Unfortunately, there are still organizations that allow you to gain access to an account with a social security number. Right? Tie that in with a bit of social engineering. Someone calls up the call center of an organization with that social security number, and they can typically get a customer service representative to do a lot of things, including providing access to the online account, resetting passwords, effectively giving them a foot in the door to gain control of an account. But it's not just the more sensitive personal information, it's also information like usernames and passwords. You wouldn't think generally, because we place so much value on social security numbers, that a username and password is really valuable information. But then think about how often you reuse a password. Well, criminals know that. And so they breach organizations. They take lists of usernames and passwords, and in an automated fashion, they will basically use that list. Right? They will take those usernames and passwords and ping sites of different organizations, banks, retailers, mobile network operators, healthcare providers, insurers, until they find pairs that give them access to an account. Breaches are contributing to this trend, along with, in essence, very poor authentication controls. And I know Mark talked about it just a bit, but fact of the matter is, weak authentication is prolific, it's ubiquitous. We actually conduct another study on authentication, and what we define as strong authentication among businesses that have a digital property, adoption's in the single digits. Most organizations rely on a username and password, and criminals use that to their advantage after breaching information like usernames and passwords. And the other type of fraud I think that's worth mentioning in the context of breaches is new account fraud. For folks who work in financial services or related industries, you may view this as application fraud, but in essence, it's where a criminal takes personally identifiable information and opens an account as though they were the victim. This type of fraud is also on the rise. This is a lot easier to connect, I think, in our minds with a data breach. We understand that personal information is compromised, they put it into a form online, they've opened an account. But what I think is more interesting here, and is much more problematic for the consumer, is that the fraud itself is changing. The reason they're opening accounts using information that's compromised in a breach is changing. So you'll notice that the incidence rate grows, but the amount lost does not. So we may view that as a good thing inherently. Less money has been lost. But there's a reason why more consumers are being affected by this type of fraud, but less money is being lost. And that's because criminals are opening accounts that in and of themselves have no monetary value. So what you'll see here are the number of existing account fraud victims. So consumers who have had an existing account. It could be a debit card account, it could be credit cards, it could be a loan account, it could be an investment account. the number of existing account fraud victims who also had a new account opened using their personal information. Criminals value the complete identity of an individual. And we are at a point where the complete identity of pretty much any person in the United States can be found online. And what criminals use that information for is to get paid, right? So they have information that gives them access to an account where you may have your retirement, but they also have information they can use to open a new account. Why would they do that? Well, banks check, right? Organizations check to see where money is being sent. And this is just an example. There are many reasons why they would. But consider if a criminal has access to your account, right, that has your retirement in it, and they want to move tens of thousands of dollars, there are going to be pretty strong checks in place. And what banks and other institutions will do is they will verify ownership of the destination account. And there are third-party services that provide that verification. Criminals know that. So armed with all of your personal information, they will open up a new account. It'll have information that matches the compromised account. So when banks go to verify the destination account, it verifies, and money is moved. And it doesn't have to be something as grand or as sinister as it's draining a retirement account. It could be something as simple as opening a PayPal account, right, to monetize a stolen credit card, to monetize a stolen checking account. We've seen this kind of fraud grow considerably, and criminals are opportunistic. They have all the information they need. Authentication controls generally are weak, and identity verification is also generally pretty weak. So long and short is that there is a very strong relationship between breaches and fraud, and that has not necessarily changed, but what has changed is the nature of the data that's being lost and how that information is being misused. And for consumers, we recognize that, at least on a subconscious level, but many of us are also being affected. There are steps that organizations can take to change this paradigm. Unfortunately, though, not all of them are regulated in the same way. There is nothing that unifies their approach in keeping consumers safe, whether that comes to data security or protecting existing accounts or identities. And as such, we've seen fraud respond and take advantage. And this trend will continue until organizations improve their security postures. And we are all going to suffer until that comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Thank you for all your insights on data breaches and the resultant fraud that consumers experience. I'll now ask does anyone have any follow-up comments either on your own presentation or one of the presentation of the other panelists? No? Okay.
So maybe we can start with a question. I couldn't help but compare Al's research with Sebastian's. And so, if Sebastian's research suggests that firms can or do essentially offset the negative consequences of a breach, and that suggests perhaps they're not internalizing the costs of a breach. And Al's research to me seems to suggest that consumers are experiencing harms associated with data breaches. So if these two situations or research are correct, then is there essentially a market failure? And I'd be interested to hear the panelists' thoughts.
Well, I think you have to consider Sebastian's comments when you start talking about market failure. It does not seem as though there are the proper incentives in place for organizations to change the way they do business, and as a result, we continue to see breaches occur. And it's not as though criminals are incredibly inventive. They do the same thing over and over again, and moving from organization to organization. And I mean, that's what keeps the folks at Verizon, I'm sure, very busy.
Yeah, certainly with the financially motivated ones. You have the ability to be more opportunistic because it's not necessarily, I need this set of Social Security numbers or I need this set of payment cards, whereas the ones that are looking more for trade secrets, then it's going to be a lot more targeted. But yeah, as you just said, and so they don't necessarily need to evolve so much. It's more like, oh, well, that guy raised the bar up to here. I'm still have a lot of low-hanging fruit that I am able to reap. I can pull that and still make money.
And just as far as the organizations that are being affected, surely governments are affected, nonprofit organizations are affected, but for businesses, what we've historically seen in our data is when they think about security, the top motivating factors for them are whether or not it's cheap and easy, right? When they're making decisions about what they're using, cheap and easy tend to go right to the top of the list, and that seems to be incompatible with the needs of protecting the data that they have, whether it's their own or consumers.
So at the time when I was doing my research, something was emerging, like the relationship with insurance on data breaches. And you could see a pattern where there was actually a mismatch between people's insurance, like pure insurance against data breaches, and also the amount of media that they were using in order to alleviate any effect of data breaches. So now, I don't know if both of you guys are aware about the more formed market for cyber insurance, for example, because before there was a real mismatch. When doing that research, people didn't know what they were insuring themselves against, and then insurance companies actually didn't know how to price it properly.
Well, I think that's going to be one of the forces that actually improves security postures, because insurance companies are and will be more likely to demand better security among the companies they are insuring. Obviously, there's no absolute security, but if you're going to indemnify an organization, you want to be sure, at least to some extent, that the risk is as low as you can manage.
Do you see in the data the same firms experience the same types of breaches over time? And based on your research, what evidence do you see of learning in the market by firms and consumers?
Yeah, so I don't know if you're referring to the exact same organization,
Yes.
the exact same breach. I'm sure that happens. The interesting thing with my data set is the majority of it, I actually don't know who the victim is. So, for example, when the Secret Service provides me information on breaches that they've responded to, I get demographic information, and I get, obviously the tactics used, et cetera. But I don't get who the end victim was. And we don't need that for us to do our work with it, and that allows us to keep the anonymity of it. I'm hopeful, that in a lot of these cases, some of these breaches, again, they go to things that aren't necessarily earth-shattering. There are breaches that occur that it's a fairly straightforward and simple fix that could at least have broken that particular event chain. There's nothing to say that they can't circle back and try a new avenue. But I don't know. I'm hopeful, because a lot of times we're not seeing what I would call highly sophisticated attacks. A lot of these are very opportunistic. It's going after weaker configurations, weak authentication schemes. So there's a higher chance that they can learn from their mistakes. And I'm hoping that what my report does is allow people to learn from the other guy's mistakes. So again, but I don't have any sort of hard data percentages on that.
I want to switch gears a little bit and ask Al a question about one of his slides. It seemed quite interesting to me that you pointed out that there's a cynicism with consumers about data breach notification. And so that to me seems a bit counterintuitive, but maybe you can sort of elaborate as to sort of what you attribute to this cynicism, and how, if I guess, how would you improve data breach notifications if this really is the case with consumers?
So I think part of the challenge is that we've all gotten, to my earlier point, notifications before. The notifications we continue to get look very much like the old notifications. And in and of themselves, there's no longer any remedial value for the consumer in those. They're not going to learn anything new by reading the newest breach notification. All they're going to learn is that they were breached, in essence. I don't think they even care how it happened, right? In fact, there may be so much spin, after the breach is announced, that they have a hard time making out what actually happened in the first place. The challenge ultimately is that for consumers, we are, again, more aware of fraud. We're not being provided with anything in the event of a breach that makes us feel as though we're going to be safer. And so you're getting a piece of paper, and how many pieces of mail do we all still get, right? It feels very kind of perfunctory, something that has to be sent to us, but doesn't give us anything. I don't know if changing a piece of paper is going to make consumers feel much better. I think it's more about providing something to them that makes them feel as though they will be safer. At the same time, if breaches continue to occur in much the same way from organization to organization, the kind of information continues to be lost everywhere, and consumers don't feel like they have a lot of control. Giving them all the identity protection in the world still isn't going to totally undo their cynicism, right? Because the problem still exists. And what am I going to do after I have 5 different identity protection plans? I'm probably going to be pretty cynical about that too.
Anyone else have any comments on that?
I mean, I would probably look at it kind of as from a consumer, not necessarily from the researcher, but yeah, kind of what you said. It's almost like, oh, yet another, form that I'm getting, and I can see that you've given me a year, credit check. Okay, but there's nothing in here that shows me or gives me any sort of confidence that, you can understand why it happened in the first place, that you have controls that are what's going to be different from you and from the people that work in your security practitioners that are going to prevent me from getting another one of these pieces of paper 1 year, 2 year, 3 years from now.
Yeah,
So you don't really get that kind of warm and fuzzy feeling from them. It's just more along the lines of, oh, they have to do this, so here's my obligatory piece of paper from them, but I'm not getting any good sense of, yep, we know what happened, we've made steps, and we've, this type of thing. You don't get really a good, it's not really confident that it's just not going to happen again.
I mean, a piece of paper does not tell you what the risk is to you.
Yep.
Right? And we cannot possibly expect that every piece of paper we send out to an individual is going to be customized to their risks. And it feels almost like something that needs to be solved. Again, digital is part of the problem, but I think it's also part of the solution. Having an understanding of who the consumer is, where they do business, what that breach could translate into ultimately, as far as fraud is concerned, and providing them with real solutions for their digital life. That is not a piece of paper. That's something totally different. Right now, people pay for that kind of thing. And again, not to say identity protection is a solution we need to be throwing on people, but I don't think you can improve the notification enough to undo the cynicism.
And back to the research that I've done over that sample, 2005, 2014 data, the issue is also that the states have different requirements. So you end up with the key question, like which one takes precedent? If you have a multi-state disclosure issue, then questions gets raised. And I don't even know the answer to that, and I think it's usually very contentious. In terms of breach fatigue, that's also something that you could find in the sample. Early on, when there were not a lot of privacy breaches, the effect of those breaches were higher. Like I gave you the average number, that was 24 basis points, but it could go as high as like 60 or 70 basis points in the early years. Whereas the closer you get to 2010 in the sample, then the smaller that particular effect. So this is also an interesting trait that I think there are more and more breaches.
So piggybacking on this, if consumers are becoming more cynical about things like breach notifications from companies, do you see changes in their behavior? Or are they becoming more? Do you see anything as far as they becoming more proactive about their data security or other kind of changes to their market behavior?
We track behaviors pre and post fraud, for example. We noticed a rather disconcerting trend started 2 or 3 years ago. Historically, when people experienced fraud, one of the first things they did was, they shut off all their paper statements and they went online because they just didn't want things going through the mail. Starting a few years ago, it kind of went the other way, where people, after they experienced fraud, would stop banking online, right? They'd stop using online services out of fear that that's where the risk was. That's problematic because digital allows individuals to do so much. Obviously it allows businesses to reach a wider population. But that being said, we tend to be very reactive as consumers. So post-fraud, we see people do things like get identity protection. We see them, step up their security posture, right? They take advantage of two-factor authentication. If you use Gmail, Google's come out and said less than 10% of all Gmail users use two-factor authentication. If consumers were really demonstrating some of the concern that we see in the data in their security behaviors, I think the adoption of two-factor authentication with Gmail and other online services just generally would be higher. It's not. People are concerned. I think there's just a disconnect between knowing what they should be doing, right, and what they're actually doing. So we see them do things only after they experience fraud, but beforehand, it's kind of, there's no rhyme or reason for them. And I think that speaks to the fact that they need more education. They need more of an understanding of what the implications are for them and what they can actually do. But as our digital life continues to expand, that can almost seem like overwhelming. We have an unlimited number of digital accounts. If you have to protect your entire life, that's a tall order.
Okay. So actually, piggybacking on that, so if individuals only respond after experiencing a breach, right, you can also think of that about terms and firm responses. So going to Sebastian's research about market, is it possible that the market is just confident that firms will take appropriate measures to eliminate the vulnerabilities discovered by a breach?
So I cannot answer that, right? So based on my research, what you find though is there's a high likelihood that firms have that store of positive news that they hold on. So I don't say it's something that they have to release, but it could be something as announcing a joint venture. It could be something as simple as the nomination of someone or buying a particular type of widget that they could wait a month or so. And you see that in the data too. So if you look at and you do a word analysis, you notice that those are the types of news that come out or expectations about future earnings most of the time. So this is something that is done. Whether or not it is done on purpose, obviously there's no answer to that, but it's just surprising that on average this is the sort of result that you would find.
Did anyone have follow-up? And Sebastian, this is actually a question from the audience. It's a follow-up to your research. What breaches are not represented in the news that you have found that you discuss in your paper? And is there a trend by size or by industry?
So I'm going to answer the second part. It was already difficult with a sample to have size. Less than 50% of a sample had actual numbers, even estimated numbers. So most of those breaches, I think currently it is more often than not that we get an idea of how many people have been breached. For some breaches that were not reported in the news, it was mainly a loss of laptop, for example. Someone forgot a laptop on a train, and that was reported on people's website, but didn't make it as a news event. And I cannot recall the company, but that was that type of issue, which the laptop contained personal information for the people that were working at that company, was a member of HR. But perhaps because no one knows whether or not it was breached, there was no report in the news.
I can touch on that a little bit just from kind of the data that we get in. When you look at, we have a category of lost and stolen assets. And the two industries that are very prominent in that are healthcare and public sector. And we go out of our way in the report to say, hey, we are not saying that I think that healthcare workers and people that work in state, federal, local governments lose their laptops more than anybody else. But they have to disclose it when they do. and so we have a lot of data on industries that have to disclose things like that. So that's why you'll see such a high level of it's so easy for us to find healthcare breaches. In just even using open source methods. We don't have to worry about some of our other partners providing it to us. We do similar things where we look out there and we look for publicly disclosed data breaches, and that is part of one of the data sets that goes into the full report. So there's a lot of that is tied to what industry and what type of data.
This is a question from the audience. For the Javelin estimates of consumer costs from breaches, who pays the costs? Is it only consumer costs, or is some or all the costs borne by firms?
So the larger number I shared, I believe it was 16.8 billion. That is inclusive of all losses. Now, consumer costs are a portion of that, and there are some costs that are not necessarily reflected in the larger number. So consider that 16.8 billion is really direct losses. For consumers, you have both direct losses, cases where they reported fraud and an organization said, no, you pay it, right? Because that can happen despite federal regulations. There can be cases of fraud, especially new account fraud, where the consumer cannot, in essence, prove that they were not responsible, right? That burden of proof practically falls on the victim. But on top of that, I think it's a good example to use. In the case of new account fraud, I may need to file a police report, right? So I take time off work. I may need to get a lawyer. And so I have additional costs beyond what the fraudster actually got away with, and those can be borne, and typically are borne by the consumer. And that's still a $1 billion plus problem.
So we've been talking a lot about the cost of data breaches, and I want to move over to the attack vectors for data breaches for a moment. And this is in part a question from the audience, but I'll sort of add a little bit to it as well. So first, we've seen this increase, from Verizon's report, we've seen this increase in social engineering. And so, I'd be interested in hearing how phishing and social engineering attacks have become, whether or not they become more sophisticated over time, and if so, sort of how. And then tacking onto that, the audience question, has Verizon observed any measurable differences in the frequency of attacks or use of particular attack vectors when accounting for particular operating systems or server types?
Okay, so the first question kind of regarding phishing and social engineering, and when we have social engineering involved, probably 90-some% of the time it's actually phishing. And the reason for that is it works. So we have data from multiple security awareness training vendors. So you hire them, they'll actually phish your users and just tell you who took the bait, who didn't, how good are you doing better than the last time we did this, et cetera, et cetera. And it was about a 7% hit rate for any so what we send a campaign out, all those emails that were sent out, 7% of them someone will take the bait. So it works. And it's also very easy to do. It's a very low cost, very efficient style of attack. And if it doesn't work, oh well, you'll just try to phish the next person, right? And so that's why we continue to see that coming up. It's a very good way of, and we also take a look at how networks are kind of set up, right? We have some web servers over here, and they get direct interaction from anybody on the internet. Well, how could I interact with someone's workstation? Well, I can do that via email, and so it's a great way to try to get a foothold into a corporate network. Now, as far as level of sophistication, it kind of runs the gamut. You're always going to see just throw it out there, the actual just phishing. Let's see who will actually take this bait. You will see targeted phishing attacks. It's called spear phishing is kind of the terminology for it, and that's when you're not just sending it out to anybody, but you're sending it out to a specific person because of the role that they have. You've probably done some gathering of intel via their LinkedIn, their LinkedIn pages or other social media. So it allows you to kind of craft a narrative to make it a higher likelihood that they're going to click that. Hey, I think you're going to go to that blank conference. Here's a PDF on the agenda or some after parties or something like that. It's topical. It's not out of the blue, and it's something you'll go ahead and click on. So, and then the second part was in regards to
Just sort of the measurable difference, if you've seen measurable differences in the frequency of the attacks and the.
Based on operating system, things like that. Often we don't get that level of detail. Now, there are certain, I'm not going to get in any sort of this operating system is better than or worse than that operating system. Frequently, what we see is not necessarily weaknesses in the way that the underlying system code was developed, but we see weaknesses in how people have implemented that in their environment. So a lot of times it is a weak configuration, not necessarily a software code bug, which would be, specific on, one OS versus the other. There are certain types of vulnerabilities that might be exploited with more often than others, and we've seen things like that. Browser-based vulnerabilities are ones that, if you are, those are ones that attackers like to go after because they've had good success with that in the past, and again, it gets you onto a particular device in the network. So we will see some weaknesses exploited with more regularity than others, but it's not this OS versus that OS or this type of web server versus that type of web server, at least not to where I can provide, any sort of guidance or hard numbers on that.
This is another question from the audience. To what extent is there evidence that those who steal data in large sophisticated breaches with social security numbers and full identity data, how do they monetize the data? Do they do it gradually, or do they try to monetize it immediately? Do we have a sense of that?
Yeah, so generally they fall into a couple camps, right? You have cases where data is compromised and that individual organization looks simply to sell the data, right? They have no desire to commit fraud in any way, shape, or form. They're going to realize values by selling it on, the open market. So whether that's, forums on the deep web or on dark web or wherever, they may do some testing of that information. So they'll take, let's say they get a list of usernames and passwords. They'll test them at big banks, right? And they'll see how much money is in those accounts. And the accounts where there's weak authentication and plenty of money, they will price those credentials higher than they will other credentials. It's the same thing with credit cards, right? A higher limit versus lower limit cards. Higher limit cards are worth more. Lower limit cards are worth less. They'll even do things like package them up by zip code because they know that banks and credit card issuers will do verifications of where the cards are used relative to the zip codes of the owners. And so they'll do additional steps to make the data more valuable, right, to different criminals. So you have that population. And then you have those who compromise the information to misuse it and to actually commit fraud. Those tend to be more vertically integrated organizations. So they have the capability to both glean information and then to put it into use, whether that's opening a new accounts online or even it's less popular today because of EMV chip cards, but take card data, put it on what they call white plastic, which is just kind of like blank cards or gift cards, and go to the streets and start using it. You tend to see more breaches are committed. The theft of personal information is more likely to be committed by organizations that are not planning to commit fraud. They're generally very different skill sets, but you do have vertically integrated organizations who will do all of it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to conclude with one final question, and I'll try to combine some of the audience questions with it. So we've been doing a bit of discussing about the current trends related to data breaches, but I think we'd love to hear what your guys' thoughts are about the future of data breaches, what they look like, or what you see them looking like, like 5 years down the line. And then, on top of that, what would be your number one advice to firms and businesses for how to avoid breaches or protect themselves?
So I think from my perspective, breaches will continue. I think it's not just going to be the personally identifiable information. It's going to be anything that's not nailed down, including biometric data, right? As that becomes more often used for things like identification and authentication. we'll see, I think, a bit of a shift in tactics depending on how well that data is being protected. So you'll see organizations over time increasingly protect data with encryption and tokenization, and I don't think that wholly dissuades criminals, right? So making that data harder to misuse. Now they may target organizations that have yet to protect data in that way more often, right, rather than going after the harder target. But there's always the opportunity to do things like take advantage of user privileges and get access to data within the network, right, that's supposedly encrypted. So there's there are going to be steps that are going to be put in place to help protect our personal information. It's not a panacea, but because information always has value, personal information as well as IP, business bank account information, I mean, it's all of value. So breaches are not going to go anywhere, right? This is going to continue to be a problem. I mean, I think you'll even see in other places like Europe where more strict data privacy regulations have been put in place that breaches don't go away in totality. I think you'll probably see fewer consumer level breaches, but more targeted attacks to get information that an organization really wants to have, whether it's espionage, corporate espionage. I don't think something like GDPR is going to necessarily be the most effective tool for moving the gauge and getting businesses to better protect that information.
Anyone else?
Okay, so crystal ball, I am hopeful that some of the things that we are putting into place to make it harder to monetize stolen payment card data. So, we're still going to have these breaches, but in reality, the whole story doesn't stop there. Granted your work, it's what happens after the breach? How are they going to make money? How can we just, this is kind of our economics and how do we defend against them? And then from this point, this is their economics and how do we ruin this? Or how do we make it a lot harder? Like most notably with like card present fraud. So we talked about, being able to clone cards, white plastic, things like that. If we can reduce the effectiveness of that, that's going to have to cause them to, change their plans a little bit. I could see that then putting, a higher value on personal information to do the, tax return type fraud, the account takeover, a new account type fraud, if they're not making the same return on their investment that they were with stolen payment cards. And also some of the monetizable events that don't necessarily require a data breach. So are they going to, a lot of times things aren't new, it's just kind of nuanced. So are we going to have different styles of kind of ransomware type of attacks where they're going and they're holding the utility and the availability of something to be able to make a buck. So I'm thinking that might be the way that they would go.
I can only highlight obviously what was in the paper, but the idea is a good look at the disclosure laws by state would be a thing to think about, and also looking at the mechanism that firms have in order to attenuate the impact of privacy breaches would also be something that at the time I was advocating.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank our presenters for their thoughtful comments on these, very real and impactful issues. With that, we're going to be breaking for lunch. There's a cafeteria located on this floor. Please remember that if you leave the building for any reason, you'll have to go back through security, so please plan accordingly, and we will recommence after lunch at 1 p.m. Thank you.